Well, that didn't take long, did it? Barely 3 weeks after winning the election, our new Labor government's support for Israel was put to the test, and it was found wanting. The United Nations Human Rights Council plans to introduce a permanent commission of inquiry to investigate Israel's alleged human rights abuses, the only country to be subject to such targeting. And while Israel is not a perfect country, I can't see how comparing the defence of its citizens under a strong democratic and moral code is anything remotely like the behaviour of a corrupt terrorist leadership that breaks every rule in the Human Rights Book and is never called to account for it, especially by the United Nations. In response to this UN action, a statement of condemnation led by the United States, along with Canada and the UK, was signed by 22 countries. Australia was not one of them. In a major foreign policy shift for this country, the Albanese government refused to sign it. So instead of showing consistency of policy and expressing solidarity for Israel by standing with our major allies, it opted to make its own statement because it wanted to take, quote, a balanced approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To give credit where it is due, the government rightly expressed fundamental concerns about the nature of the Human Rights Council's permanent commission of inquiry into Israel, but then threw in some comments about the human rights concerns it has in the so-called Palestinian territories. If this is any indication of the way the government will behave on issues relating to Israel, then it is going to make an art form out of sitting on the fence. But that's not the worst of it. Some of our communal organisations, the ones that think of themselves as pro-Israel, couldn't wait to lick the boots of the Labor government by saying that this decision of taking a backward step from overtly supporting Israel was, well, sort of okay, and maybe even bordering on pretty good. They liked the bit about not being happy with the Human Rights Council having a permanent agenda item criticising Israel. That was principled. But weren't too fussed about the government's concern for Palestinians living in the, quote, occupied territories. You need to know that in this country, the AJA has been the only organisation to say that the government statement simply wasn't good enough. Our communal organisations never like to be called out for their wimpish behaviour, so you can now expect them to retort with all the usual insults against the AJA. But this softness and advocacy has a more serious potential consequence. Governments respect strength, not weakness, which means that the anti-Israel voices in government and the bureaucracy will be emboldened by their observation of such little resistance from some in the Jewish community. So, if you are looking for a strong and unequivocal advocacy of Israel in this country, if you are looking for absolute and principled rejection of the UN's unashamed bias and hostility towards Israel, and if you are looking for a clear and unambiguous voice in our community, don't look to our government and don't look to our old communal organisations. Now, more than ever, there is a distinct point of difference between all of them and us. The AJA doesn't claim to speak for the entire Australian Jewish community, but we do claim to be a voice for those Australians who are seeking a tougher and more moral approach to Israel and issues of interest to the Jewish community. The way our communal organisations so meekly rolled over for the ALP will almost certainly be a green light for more anti-Israel moves to come. This is Alan Freedman for the Australian Jewish Association.